mua ona si ia le inga ma le whawhitai lo mātou atua. O tātou whatasinga he masimo fie i nei pō. O te whatalo whaina le au mālo, o mātou mawhai ona whapoto le nei pō. O lea o tamwhaina ona whai sina pepeha pupuu ina ia whai loa le whai longa le ngangana Samoa, le ngangana Māori, ai maisia le ngangana Pālangi. A whio mai, sa su mai, mamaliu mai. Ko Waio, ko Alex Veila LP toki papa, ko Matilena Pei toki mama, ko Niko taku tuangane, ko Edna rawa ko Duff aku tuahine, ko Ngāti Hāmoa te iwi, ko Savai toku motu, ko Sawhai rawa ko nei afu, o ku hapu engari ko papaio ia manakitia toku kainga, ko Satuia tua te moana, ko Vaia te maunga, ko te wānanga o Aotearoa, te whare wānanga, ko Ekalesia Mito Tisi Samoa, te whare karakia, ko Lydia Pei Ahau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Talofa lava, kia ora and warm greetings to you all. First and foremost, I'd just like to give praise and thanks to the man above for the wonderful blessings he has bestowed on us tonight. Second of all, I'd just like to acknowledge John Walden for opening our evening, Professor John Potter for the privilege to be able to hear you speak here tonight, and to all our esteemed guests who have come along to enjoy this wonderful event. I'd also like to extend a massive thank you to everyone and anyone that has made this night possible, from staff to our families, our sponsors, our volunteers, for your guidance and support for being a part of this awesome event. Lastly, I'd just like to make a special mention to my beautiful friend Siobhan for your tireless and endless work you've put into making this amazing event happen for us. Alofa anga te le mokoi. Excuse me. So welcome everybody, my name is Lydia Pei and it is an absolute honour to be here tonight to share my journey with you all. A little bit about myself. My parents hail from the beautiful islands of Savai and Samoa, but my brothers and sisters and I were born and raised here in the Māori Manawatu. My family belong to and are founding members of the Samoa Methodist Church here in Palmerston North and are still active in the church and in the community. Six years ago, I gave birth to my youngest baby, Naonesta. He was born on September the 3rd, 2012. And 3 months later, while I was putting him down for a nap, while also having a nap myself, I noticed there was a significant bump in my stomach. I thought to myself, oh shit, there better not be another baby. Turns out I actually wish it was another baby. In actual fact, it turned out to be a mass about the size of a mango. Not long after that, I was booked in for some surgery to get rid of that sucker. My recovery process was a bit of a nightmare, from infections to hospital visits to surgery another 3 times, and finally came the result we had been waiting for. I was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer, gastrointestinal stroma tumour, or GIST. It is commonly found in men, much older men. But I'm a bit of a rebel like that, so I thought if I'm going to get one, I might as well be a bit special about it. I remember having to do my own research into accessing services about who I could possibly talk to about my diagnosis. I came across this beautiful woman, Pauline Wharero, who was based at Cancer Society Manawatu. She had all these amazing contacts and put me in touch with some great people. And this is where my aha moment came from. I came to a realization that I needed to start appreciating me, accepting me, cherishing me, and looking after me. One thing I've learned on this journey is cancer does not discriminate. It doesn't care how old you are, it doesn't care what colour you are, and it doesn't care what status you are in your life. And here's the second part of my aha moment. Cancer does not define who I am. I decided I needed to start treating my mind and more so my body well. And for a Samoan that loves food, woo, that was some hard work. It was a pretty hard task, but fast forward 5 years, and well, to be honest, I wasn't that much smaller than I was back then. But mentally, emotionally, and a little bit physically, I'm in a better place than I was back then. I decided I wanted to give back to my community, give back to my people, give back to anyone and everyone who has come into my life. So here I am. Just finished, like literally just finished on Tuesday, my third year of studying towards getting my degree in bicultural social work at Te Wānanga o Aotearoa. I've just come off a placement of 12 weeks at the Cancer Society, and man, what an experience it was. The highest of highs, the battles with myself to get over the lows, and somewhere in between, the glimmer of sunshine and moonlight, always guiding me through. And as of this week, I've actually secured a position at Cancer Society as the Relay for Life event administrator. So if you came to put in the team, come see me after this. So I can feel my friend giving me the eyes. So I just wanted to leave you with this. Almost all of us are affected by or know someone affected by cancer. Don't let that define who you are or who they are. Encourage each other to do something special for yourselves. Embrace the change. Acknowledge the hurt. Accept the love. And always, always be true to you. It has been a real honour to be up here sharing my story of my journey with you all here tonight. So I'd just like to say whakate lava, whakawhitai, and thank you for being so awesome and amazing. And now I'd just like to invite Siobhan to get up here so we get this party started.
Kia ora koutou katoa, nau mai, haere mai, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā rau, rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Siobhan Hollows and I am a health promoter at Cancer Society Manawatu. I'm honoured to be here tonight and to have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Professor John Potter. A few months ago, I saw John on TV speaking in a news segment about diet, and after being a bit cheeky and trying my luck and sending him an email, was excited to not only receive a quick reply from him, but one that said he'll be happy to come and speak for us here in Palmerston North. So you have to bear with me because John's a pretty impressive man. John is the Chief Science Advisor to the Ministry of Health. He is Professor at the Centre of Public Health Research at Massey University. He's Adjunct Professor at University of Canterbury, and he is Emeritus Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Washington. John is Senior Advisor at the world-leading Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Centre in Seattle, which is one of the most substantial cancer research organisations in the world. He has had a long and distinguished career which is focused on cancer and the role of nutrition, environmental and host factors relating to cancer. He has recently ventured into the study of planetary overload. John previously held the prestigious position of leading the Division of Public Health Sciences at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Centre, which is one of the biggest and most productive groupings of public health scientists anywhere in the world. He chaired the international panel that produced the seminal report on food, nutrition and the prevention of cancer. He was also the chair of the Scientific Committee of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. John has won numerous international research awards and has published approximately 700 scientific papers, chapters and books, most recently being Thought for Food, which is on sale tonight in the foyer. So the word busy doesn't quite cut it. We at the Cancer Society are very appreciative of John taking the time to travel to Palmerston North and to speak with us here this evening about what he has learned in his fascinating career so far about our diets and how we can hope to reduce our risk of cancer and other diseases. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor John Potter.
Siobhan, thank you, and thank you all very much for the opportunity. I've got a mic attached to me. Is this one now off? No. It probably should be, otherwise we'll end up with some sort of horrible feedback noises, I suspect. I'll give it to you, you can hide it. What I'd like to do this evening is talk to you, if that were, oh good, it works. Talk to you a little bit about the intersection between diet and human health with a particular focus on cancer, but I'll talk about some other things as well. And at the end of it, I'll just talk a little bit about why diet and human health and some of the changes that we are seeing in our world all kind of interconnect. But I'm going to start with the idea of the loss of healthy years. Now, we all know about the concept of life expectancy, and that's sort of how long will I live and then depart. And obviously, if you die young, you are losing some years of life. But if you get ill as you age, you're also losing some years of healthy life. So there's this concept of the loss of healthy years, and one way or another, as we age, we all contribute to it. And the question is, how little can we contribute to the loss of healthy years in New Zealand? That might be a goal for one of the things that we could do. What causes loss of healthy years in New Zealand? And this means, again, it's the diseases as we get older particularly, although some of these diseases occur young, as you've just heard from Lydia. And some of these diseases cause death and cause premature death. But the major causes in New Zealand are diseases of the brain and nervous system, neurologic diseases and psychiatric diseases. So we're talking about dementia and Parkinson's disease and so on. Cardiovascular disease, diseases of the heart and the blood vessels, including the ones that get to our brain. Digestive diseases, and there are a lot of digestive disorders we see causing both pain and misery as well as loss of healthy years in New Zealand. Musculoskeletal diseases, and particularly as we age, we end up with disorders of the joints and muscles. And then cancer, which is a really important part of the burden of disease in community. And those diseases together account for about 2/3 of all the health loss in New Zealand. This slide here just tells you some of the factors that you're looking at, and I'm just going to outline several of them for you. These are the ones that cause the big losses. And what you'll see is these are proportions of the total burden of health loss, and you'll see that the big blue splodge is cardiovascular disease, and the brown one refers to cancer. And diet and high body weight, you can see, are contributing quite a lot to both our burden of cardiovascular disease and our burden of cancer. And then if you look at alcohol further down, that's a key player in all this as well. And then one more in here, low physical activity. And those together are a major set of causes of the health loss that we're talking about. And remember that cancer is part of this story. The majority of human cancers, as well as the other chronic diseases that we will touch on and we have already touched on, the majority of human cancers are influenced by what we eat and drink, by the way in which we exercise or don't, by our body weight, by smoking, and many people would have put that first, but I'm well aware of the sorts of changes that are going on in New Zealand. We should think about that. And work and workplace are important in the burden of cancer as well, because some people get exposed to toxic processes, toxic compounds in their workplaces, and they matter. But when it comes to thinking about the food and drink, the exercise, the body weight, the smoking, some of these habits and exposures are in turn influenced by our culture, our family, our times, the world in which we live, the time in which we live. But they're also strongly influenced by what foods and drinks are produced, advertised, and sold. And we might even come back to that as a possible topic later on this evening when we have a question time. I'll also sit and have a dialogue with Siobhan. She insisted that she wanted to ask a whole lot of questions ahead of every one of you, so you have to think about it. Some people make conscious choices about their food and drink and exercise and so on. But particularly when it comes to food, very often we don't examine our habits and we just kind of take them for granted. And perhaps we imagine that the way we eat and drink and live now is the way we always have. But some of us have a suspicion that isn't true, and some of it no it isn't. So this is the question. Is that true? So let me start and think about, let's take us back in time a bit now, and think about our ancestors before we settled down into farming communities, before we settled down into urban areas. So we settled down into the beginning of farming in the world is somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years ago. Before that, we were much more nomadic, although when people lived on the coast, they were probably fairly settled. But gatherer hunters used to walk around large parts of the world. And in that world, these things were rare. Sugar, salt, fat, meat, alcohol. And then on the right-hand side, tobacco, poppies, cocoa, cannabis, coffee. All of these things are rare in nature and can be used and found, but you have to work for them. And we have a taste for them all. And because they're rare, there are no deleterious consequences to our occasional overindulgence. So if we beat the chimpanzees to a tree full of overripe fruit, and we sat there under the tree singing songs while somebody kept an eye out for the cheetahs, we would have been fine, because we would have just had that one booze up maybe once in a lifetime, certainly only once in 10 years. So there weren't any deleterious consequences of these things because we didn't see them very often. But because there were no deleterious consequences, we never learned to handle them very well. And so we haven't evolved natural curbs on their overconsumption. And one of the things that happened was that, hey, we like these things, let's grow them. And once we'd established that we didn't just have to go out and gather and hunt, we began to cultivate some of these to keep ourselves in calories and in comfort. And our commitment to that approach has led us, and especially recently, and I'll draw your attention to some of the information we've got, has led us to more and more intensity in the way we raise our food and drugs, and more focus on some of these things that are otherwise rare in our world. Through human history, we raised and consumed modest amounts of these, and I'll give you just two examples for this purpose because they're both important for our discussion. In traditional agricultural societies, so this is when we began to settle down, meat was rarely higher than 5 to 10 kilograms a year. In most societies, meat was a celebratory food. It was something that you had at the beginning of autumn or in the middle of autumn when you had to slaughter the calf, or you had to, because you couldn't keep the animal through winter. You had a celebratory, festive use of some of these things, but the consumption on a usual year would have been quite low. And the sugar consumption data are really interesting because sugar used to be very, very rare. Sugar was a hard crop to raise, and most of the sugar that people raised was from honey. And then beginning with the exploitation of a fancy grass that we now call sugarcane, we were able to raise sugar in much larger quantities. But the Brits have this kind of data, and in 1700, the consumption of sugar per year was about 2 kilograms from all sources. Compare that with what's going on now. Our meat consumption in New Zealand, Australia, US, it's now around 120 kilograms a year, which is somewhere between a 12 and 24-fold increase. And it's been made largely possible by refrigeration, by growing animals in much more concentrated ways, particularly in the United States, by expending more energy on stocking the world with cattle. The total biomass of cattle on the planet is now 4 times the biomass of humans. And one of the consequences is we're pushing out all the other animals. We need to think about that a little. But you compare that with the meat consumption in India, it's about 3 kilograms a year, so much more like the sorts of numbers that we were talking about in our more distant past. Per capita sugar consumption has gone up from that 2 kilograms a year around a few hundred years ago to now 40, even 50 kilograms a year. So again, this massive increase in consumption. And it's different over a very short period of time. We actually haven't evolved to change our metabolism over that time to take account of these massive changes in our diet. Our demand and our capacity increasingly stretch the boundaries of what is possible. I just mentioned the sheer size of our herd of cattle in the world. And there are deleterious consequences for the planet, and there are deleterious consequences for our health. So I'm just going to explore a few of those with you and give you some bits of data that we can look at. I don't expect you to sort of take huge amounts of detail here, just get a sense of what it is that we know about the relationship between our dietary practices and cancer. So I'm going to start with meat and fat, and I'm going to show you a figure This is from a paper that was in Science just quite recent, the journal Science quite recently. And it just draws attention to, along the bottom of this graph, there are two graphs up there. One is the relationship between the risk of developing bowel cancer, and the other one is the risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. And the exposure that people are talking about here is, as it happens in this particular instance, processed meat. So sausages and so on. And what you can see is that as your consumption goes up, the risk of developing the disease goes up. So it's, along the bottom you've got 5 different exposure levels, and it tracks upwards. You can see the tracking upwards of the risk, so that it's about a 50% higher risk of both bowel cancer and cardiovascular disease from being in the top consumption group versus the bottom consumption group. And that sort of pattern we see in a number of other settings, but I'll just draw that one to your attention. Red meat has a similar relationship with bowel cancer. Fat has a similar relationship with cardiovascular disease. And this is a study that the data I've just put up now, and you can see those two curves separating. Those this was two sets of women who were given different instructions about the kind of fat the amount of fat they should consume, and they were followed over the space of nearly 10 years. And you can see that slowly their risk of developing breast cancer separates, so that the lower fat group is developing less breast cancer than the high fat group. And by the time you get to the end, we're looking at something like a 15% difference in risk. Doesn't sound a lot, but breast cancer is very common, and that's a lot of breast cancers. So something about meat and fat is affecting quite a number of diseases. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but there are 3 diseases to think about for you. And I'm going to talk about sugar, and the list gets even longer. High consumption of sugar and sugar-containing foods and beverages increased. We all know about dental caries, and it's a real problem amongst kids. We're seeing kids having their teeth removed because their first set of teeth is actually getting rotted away by sugar consumption. Increase in diabetes. The higher energy intake actually matters if it's not matched by energy output, and we end up with an increase in weight, and we see increases, so weight gain, and then we see increases in body mass. So we haven't yet seen these labels, but this one would be quite good. Obesity. New Zealand has a problem with obesity that is really very marked and in the world. We have the 3rd highest adult obesity rate in the OECD, in the developed world, if you like. And you can see what's happened from this graph is going from 1977 to 2012, and you can see that the prevalence of obesity has gone from about 10% in the population up to over 30%. That's a big change in a very short time. And it's not even clear all of the causes of that, but it's a mismatch. It's about what we eat. It's a mismatch between the amount we eat and our exercise patterns. And we end up with these sorts of figures where there are 32% of the New Zealand population are obese. And even in the last few years, that's gone up. Another 10%, if you like, 29 to 32. It's 3% increase over that period. We have nearly 100,000 children aged 2 to 14. It's about 12% of the population who are obese. And look at what's happened over even that short time. 2006 and 7, it was about 8%. then it was about 11%, and now it's over 12%. And it's children who are living in the most socioeconomically deprived neighbourhoods who are bearing the biggest burden of this. They're 2.5 times as likely to be obese as children living in the least deprived neighbourhoods. That matters. We have a population that is already in jeopardy because of a whole lot of aspects of their lives, and they are burdened still further with this problem. After not smoking, being a healthy weight's the most important thing you can do to protect yourself against cancer. Strong evidence that being overweight or obese is a cause of 12 different cancers. Bowel cancer, a whole bunch of you walked through what that looks like out there. Postmenopausal breast cancer, gallbladder cancer, which is relatively uncommon but is not completely uncommon amongst Māori and Pacific. Kidney cancer, which is one of the most strongly related to obesity. Liver cancer, cancers of this bit, mouth and pharynx and larynx, so the upper mouth and upper airways, as well as esophagus, the gullet, ovary, pancreas, advanced prostate cancer, stomach cancer, and cancer of the uterus, sometimes called cancer of the endometrium. All of these 12 cancers are related to obesity. They are all, I don't mean that's the only cause, I mean all of them have obesity as part of the cause. And here's a somewhat challenging observation, because we tend to think about tobacco as being one of the major causes we have of health loss. Obesity is now a more important cause of health loss in New Zealand than tobacco. That is something we need to think about. But let's talk about tobacco. There's good news in that area. This is the map, if you like, the time course of smoking prevalence in New Zealand, and you see from the 80s to just last year, there's a steady downward slope in the number of people who are smoking. And it's an even steeper drop amongst young people who are smoking. And both of those things are good news. We have a hope of a smoke-free New Zealand by 2025. It's going to be hard work to get there from where we are at the moment. But it's a really, really important part of what we're doing to reduce cancer burden. Māori, however, have a higher smoking rates than non-Māori and higher rates of tobacco-related illness. Notice the quite higher rate among Māori adults particularly, and it's extraordinarily high amongst Māori women. And one of the things that happens in that, because it's a social shared thing, because it's part of culture, because and if you think about it, if 38% of Māori women are smoking, then approaching half of your closest friends and neighbours and family and whānau might well be smokers. It's much harder to give it up when a lot of those who are around you are smokers. And we need to think about how to work to reduce that exposure, because it's particularly problematic among pregnant Māori women where it's over 40%. And smoking is really toxic to babies in the uterus. And Māori have the youngest age of starting to smoke of all New Zealanders. We need to remember that this is really what smoking is about. It is a lethal habit. Alcohol. Alcohol's a player in all this too. I gave you a list of obesity-related diseases, particularly cancers. But alcohol's involved in a lot of disease. And there's a causal impact of the amount of alcohol consumed by any population, and it affects all of these things. Tuberculosis rates, mouth, tongue and throat cancers, so like smoking, esophageal cancer, colorectal cancer, liver cancer, female breast cancer, diabetes, alcohol use disorders fairly obviously, as well as depression, epilepsy, heart disease, stroke, rhythm disorders of the heart, pneumonia, cirrhosis, preterm birth complications, and fetal alcohol syndrome. Alcohol is the most toxic exposure of all to a baby in the uterus. But all we seem to be able to remember is alcohol's good for blood cholesterol and heart disease. And even that turns out not to be true. Recent paper, this paper is just published in The Lancet, and it's a study across over 150, I think it's about 190 countries in the world. And globally, alcohol is the 7th leading risk factor for death and loss of healthy years, and accounting for more than 2% of female deaths and more than 6% of male deaths. And for the young people, 15 to 49, alcohol is the leading risk factor and it accounts for more than 12% of male deaths. And the 3 leading causes amongst young people, now this is worldwide, not just in New Zealand, and we don't tend to see a lot of tuberculosis in New Zealand, but we're not free of it. But road injuries and self-harm are really an important part of the consequences of alcohol consumption as well. And this is, for those aged more than 50, cancers accounted for a large proportion of the alcohol attributable deaths, approaching 30% of all the female deaths and almost 20% of males. Alcohol is a serious player in here. And what this study discovered basically was that there is no minimal amount of alcohol that's good for you. The minimum is 0 drinks per week. You need to think about that very carefully. So what did these authors conclude? Alcohol is a leading cause for global disease burden and causes substantial health loss. It's the risk of all-cause mortality and of cancer specifically rises with the level of consumption, and the level of consumption that minimizes health loss is 0. We need to think about what we're doing as individuals, and we need to think about what New Zealand's alcohol control policies should look like. This is a proper conversation for all of us. But it's reasonable to ask, have we got some things that could protect us? You know, and there are some. Physical activity is one of them. One in 7 adults are active. 51% of New Zealand adults are physically active for at least 30 minutes. So that's good news. There's a lot of people doing something, and it's more men than women. Māori and non-Māori are about the same. Those are all reasonably encouraging, but you've got to ask yourself, what about the other half of the population? And at the bottom end, 1 in 7 adults are active for less than 30 minutes a week. Not now 30 minutes every day or close to every day, but less than 30 minutes a week. Pacific and Asian adults are less likely to be physically active, and older adults tend to become less physically active just at the time when we should not be slacking off on staying active we tend to do so. It's understandable, sometimes those joints hurt, sometimes we're tired, sometimes we're actually going out and taking physical exercise improves your mood and improves your sense of capacity. It may not improve the pain in your knee, but you work on it. 45% of children aged 5 to 14 usually used active transports. Again, good news, it's not big enough, but it's good news. But then you've got the sedentary behaviours, 50%, and it's higher amongst Pacific and Māori. Usually watched 2 or more hours of television, and that's down a bit, but screen time of other sorts, particularly the phones, is a really important part of what goes on. 28% of secondary school students watch television for more than 3 hours. 35% of students use the internet for more than 3 hours each day. And 32% of male students played internet games for more than 3 hours a day. Notice that sex difference. That doesn't surprise you, but it's an interesting observation that girls are much less likely to be doing internet games than boys. Another thing that there's a good to be is consuming your vegetables and fruit. And Siobhan actually mentioned this book. This was published in 1997, and it was a kind of summary of everything we knew. It's called Food, Nutrition and the Prevention of Cancer, a Global Perspective. And it was virtually everything we knew in 1997. It runs to nearly 700 pages, and I chaired the panel that produced this book. The book's now in its 3rd edition, and I've had nothing to do with it since I did this one. It was way too much work. It took me nearly 4 years of my life to get this out into the world. But this is the sort of thing that we were able to show by just looking at all the studies that have been done. And what this study shows, it's like that figure I put up where the increasing meat was associated with increasing risk. Here, increasing fruit intake is associated with a declining risk of developing stomach cancer in this particular instance. It's also, and this is from a huge study we've been doing on colorectal cancer in a whole bunch of places around the world, the details are less important than you notice that there's a lower risk of colorectal cancer, bowel cancer, associated with higher consumption of vegetables and higher consumption of fruit. And we find this all over the place. It's particularly strong for cardiovascular disease. Eating your vegetables and fruit may be even more important for reducing your risk of heart disease than it is for reducing your risk of cancer. And it is important. Well, what are New Zealanders actually doing? The proportion of women eating more than 3 serves of vegetables a day is down a little. And men, we know this, men don't eat their vegetables. That's something we should do something about collectively, men. And, you know, nagging from women isn't just the only thing to be done here. Taking responsibility is part of it. Again, with fruit, again, 2 servings a day of fruit. Women are better than men are, which is surprising, actually. Sometimes men think they eat more fruit and women eat more vegetables. But men aren't too good at either fruit or vegetables. We need to get these numbers up. Pacific and Asian men and women are likely to eat recommended 3 servings a day, are less likely to be eating those than men and women in the rest of the population. And adolescent males, is this a surprise? Adolescent males have the poorest behaviours. Only 51% aged 15 to 18 are consuming as recommended. These are things that we need to think of. These are things we've got some control over. So the discussion I'd like to have with you, I'm going to just put up 4 big questions, and not to give you answers, but to have as a discussion point. Is there a diet to which humans are well adapted? And I think I hinted at some of this in this picture, that matches our body chemistry, that's part of the history of human development, long before there were cities, even towns, a time when we needed food We had to work for it, we had to work hard for it, and when we needed to be somewhere else, we walked and ran. What does that dietary and exercise and behavioural picture tell us about now? Not that we can go back and survive, because most of us would not do it, but what can we learn? If there is such a diet and lifestyle, what might it have looked like, and how does it compare with what we're eating and drinking now, and how we move now? And how do we get from there to here? And will that tell us about maybe some of the ways we can get back? And then, could we make sufficient changes in our current behaviour patterns to recapture at least some of the important elements? We clearly are not going to go back to our gatherer-hunter roots. We are clearly not going to become coastal-dwelling fishing groups, most of us, most of the time. So what bits of it can we rebuild back into our lives? And then finally, because I want to touch on this just a little bit, are there other reasons why a lifestyle that's based on an understanding of our relationship with our past? And remember that we have a culture within New Zealand. Māori culture is much closer to those roots and has a better understanding of some of this. And some of us can learn a lot more about how to look after the land as well as look after ourselves by thinking about some of that historical knowledge, some of that cultural heart that we have. Is there something that could be better, not only for our health, but for the planet? In short, what better choices can we make now? I'm going to just touch on our impact on the planet, just briefly, because I want you to think about this as well. I already mentioned it in relation to the cattle herd. But here's the sort of a knot of intertwined relationships that actually matter. So we have diet and food choices, although a lot of us don't make those. We kind of respond to the stimulus in the world. But those diet and food choices influence the way in which our food supply works. They influence the way in which we raise food, and the food raising practices also influence the food supply. And they also influence our health. But it turns out that our food raising practices are increasingly having an impact on the environment and on climate change. So I'll just draw your attention, not so that again you will know this in detail, but just to remind you that a lot of the global warming that we're seeing now is associated with methane and carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. And the methane and the nitrous oxide, a lot of the source of those are from raising cattle. So we need to think about that, as I've already mentioned. But here's a more important question maybe. What is climate change doing to our food raising and the food supply? And this may be more of a surprise. Some of you would have already well understood that we've got a problem with carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide. But climate change is actually doing things that are beginning to make our food supply a little more tenuous than we might think it is. This extraordinary looking graph is the price of wheat since the 13th century in the world. You can see two things about it. One is that it's been very, very jagged over many years, and that's related to the fact that food supply has for a long time was very dependent on weather and climate and so on. And you can see that over time the general tendency was for that picture to go up. And then really in the last couple of 100 years, the price has been coming down and down and down and down, and becoming a little bit more stable. Not entirely stable, but a little bit more stable. One of the worrying things that's happened over the last quite brief period, really this century, is that the long downward trend in food prices has suddenly begun to change, and we've seen these spikes in food prices. Some of this is people playing fancy games, fiscal games with food futures and a bunch of other things. But at least some of this is actually due to weather and climate events in the world, and that really matters. And you can actually see it in the footprint that's been gone on. This is in Australia. This is the top graph here is the steady increase in the Australian wheat supply over the time from 1900 to about 1990. And you can see that it was just steadily increasing over that time, scattered, but there's a line that goes up. And beginning from 1990 through to 2015, the Australian wheat supply has been absolutely flat, and it's been absolutely flat despite the technological advances in a lot of growing practices. And the reason it's flat is because of climate change, because of increasing heat and reducing rainfall in a lot of the wheat growing areas of Australia. And the researchers who wrote this paper said it remains to be seen whether the technology, because the technology has actually been keeping it higher than you might expect, it remains to be seen whether the technology continued to maintain the current yields, let alone increase them to those that are going to be required by 2050. One other thing to think about is the impact of changing concentrations of CO2, because the world's getting more and more. CO2 concentrations are now at a higher level in the world than we've seen for a very, very long time. Certainly through the whole of human history, but a lot further back as well. And one of the things that happens with people tend to think that CO2, that'll improve the yield of plants. It turns out not to be true. The quality of the plants that are grown in high CO2 concentrations actually begins to decline. And this is what happens to rice. And these are just people experimenting with growing rice in different concentrations of CO2. And you see declines in protein, in iron, in zinc, which we already knew about from other observations. But you see declines in a variety of the B vitamins. And you look at the way in which the whole of Southern Asia, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, Southern Asia, major contribution of the diet comes from rice. And you ask yourself, if we continue to increase the CO2, what impact will that have on the rice supply in that part of the world, and what impact will it have on the global population of about 600 million people? So what is climate change doing to food raising, the food supply? It's starting to make our food supply more uncertain, and that's one more reason to think about how we should respond to climate change.
We do have a book, a copy of John's book. For the first person who asks a question when we get to your audience ones, and that doesn't apply to Cancer Society staff down the front. Okay, so John, what is it specifically about the vitamins and phytochemicals in plant foods that are so essential to health, and why can't we just take a multivitamin?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and even when you ask the question in a slightly different way, which is, well, can I make up for the deficiencies in my diet by taking a pill? And the answer is basically no. And part of the reason is that it's the whole food that we're adapted to. It's the whole food that not only feeds us, even if we take a pill with a whole bunch of multivitamin stuff in it, where we're still not consuming the wide variety of compounds that are in fruit and vegetables. And one of the things that's happened over a long period of time is that we make use of those compounds that we actually didn't even know about 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. We've known about vitamins for quite a long time, but we haven't known about the various other chemicals. And they actually do good and useful things. They tweak some of our own metabolism. They provide signals to cells that grow in a better way. They suppress some likely disease states that can arise. Even more interesting in a way is we for a long time we've tended to think of ourselves as, kind of, okay, we're just a human being. A whole bunch of you walked through that colon. What would have happened if you'd really walked through a colon would be that you would have run into an awful lot of bugs that live in that gut. In fact, there are more of them than there are of us. We have about 10 to the 13th cells, and there are about 10 to the 14th bugs in our gut. It's a big and tricky number, but take it from me, there are 10 times more of them than there are us. Cells. And one of the things that eating whole foods does is that a whole bunch of the food that we don't digest gets through into our colon, and there it feeds our bugs. And one of those things, I won't go through a whole long list, but one of them is what we call fibre, which is actually a whole long list. And we don't digest the fibre, but the bugs get into it and they metabolize it, and they actually use some of the energy that they create to build their own metabolic well-being, but they also create what we call short-chain fatty acids. And the most important one of those for the immediate health of our colon is a short-chain fatty acid called butyric acid. And the butyric acid that comes from the bugs in the gut fermenting the fibre actually feeds our colonic cells. And our colonic cells are happiest when they're bathed in butyric acid. Unlike a whole lot of our other cells, which like our having a decent amount of sugar and protein around, our colon cells really like butyric acid. And it's the bugs in our gut that make it from the fibre that gets through there from our food. It's a really symbiotic system, and we need to treat our bugs well. When they're doing their job, they make us happy.
Thank you, John. Okay, you talk in your book about how the excess consumption of sugar, sweetened drinks, meat and alcohol have all become normalised in our society today. You draw comparisons with tobacco. Years ago, tobacco use was seen as a normal, enjoyable and socially acceptable personal choice, where nowadays it's seen quite differently.
Yep.
What needs to change for us to no longer think it's normal to eat so much of these foods?
I think we just need to begin that conversation, just like we did with tobacco. We began to learn of the deleterious consequences of tobacco. We learned first about lung cancer because that was a sort of fairly obvious thing if you think about it. And a man named Richard Doll, who was a brilliant British epidemiologist, did a ton of work on that association. He was really the first one to nail it down properly. Showed that smoking caused lung cancer, but since then, and I put up a list for you, there are other cancers that are associated with smoking. I didn't put all of them up, but there are a number of other cancers that are associated with tobacco smoking, as well as all these other deleterious consequences. And we kind of learned them, and the more we learned, and then we learned that passive smoking was important. But we already knew that by the 1970s. I was involved in the first ever report on the impact of passive smoking. We wrote a report for what in Australia is called the National Health and Medical Research Council, a bit like our Health Research Council. And we wrote a report for them in the 70s, and it was the first report to say, this looks like a problem, even secondhand smoke. And slowly we built that perception up. But think about it, the first study that Dole and Hill wrote was in the first fairly important and definitive study was 1952. We are still fighting about tobacco. So the sooner we start to think about alcohol and sugar and meat consumption, the sooner we can get some of those, because they are now normed. And you watch a film. It used to be that everybody in films smoked, far more than actually even in the real world. Nowadays, it's there and it still sneaks in, and actually tobacco companies actually pay for actors to smoke in films. But notice how much drinking goes on in films. There hardly, you can't find a film where somebody's not drinking something, and there are some films where scene after scene after scene people are drinking. We've normed it as part of our environment. Walk out through an airport, and now you have to wind your way through this massive consumption, massive presentation of alcohol. We've normed these as though they have to be part of our lives. And it's not that you immediately have to stop, and it's not that you have to immediately give up eating your meat. It's just that you need to think about, given the numbers that I gave you, about 10 to 20-fold higher than used to be the norm. Can we bring it back a bit, and can we have that conversation?
So with technology now giving us easy access to so much information about food, it can be confusing to know what we should eat to be healthy, especially when some popular diets seem to have completely opposite recommendations.
Yep.
Some avoid meat, some encourage eating a lot of meat or fat, and some avoid carbohydrates. So what is the miracle answer, and why is there so much confusion, do you think?
No miracle answers here. This is really a matter of thinking this through, what we know, and actually thinking about the choices that we make if we can. Accepting that some choices are better than others. The sensible things to think about, I think, are we eating food that is as close to the way in which it came out of the ground, off the plant, as little modified by commercial processes, as little processed as we can manage. I appreciate busy people. I mean, there's a lot of considerations in here, but the fresher the food we can eat, the more whole food we can eat, the more the pleasure of eating in company also matters, right? We tend to forget that too. We eat on the right. Some of that stuff, you know, eat with less stress. Take a little more time. The French are very good at this, possibly too good. But eat slowly and in company and with friends or family that you like spending time with. I don't mean every day, we don't always do that, but make it part of your life. But it's something about putting the wholeness back into both our preparation, our presentation, and our consumption of food.
Thank you. The World Health Organization says that there is convincing evidence that processed meat causes cancer, as you were discussing earlier, and that red meat probably does. Mm-hmm. Is it something in the meat, or is it just how much we eat of it, or is it how we cook it?
It's probably all of those. The amount matters. You saw the dose association. It's also, for instance, processed meat. There are a lot of nitrites in processed meat. Nitrites can be turned by bacterial processes into nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are a known carcinogen. Red meat contains a whole bunch of things that are potentially the candidates here. Fat is one. The way we cook it is another. You overcook meat, you flame broil meat, you make carcinogens.
So barbecues or
in
over
barbecues,
barbecuing.
Yeah, barbecuing. But iron, the amount of iron acts in some strange and interesting ways to increase risk of cancer as well. And there are some other things in there. So it's both the nature of the meat, it's the nature of the way we prepare it, the nature of the way we process it in the case of processed meat, and the amount. If we bring all this back down to a much more modest intake, a lot of those problems go away because we've got much smaller doses of any one of them.
So if we were to reduce the meat that we were eating, or how much meat we were eating, what should we eat in its place? I know on page 60 of your book you discuss quite a few tips there.
Yeah.
And how do we make sure that we're not missing out on any essential nutrients?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things to think about, and this could be a long discussion because we'd end up with some series of cooking classes and purchase classes and all that sort of stuff. But one of the things to think about is not just a set of rules, but cuisines. There are in the world cuisines that are much less meat-focused than the traditional Western meat and three veg kind of diet. And historically, there are Mediterranean diets, which are a bit closer to our pattern, but meat there tending to be a garnish or being on the side of the plate rather than being right in the middle of it. But other cuisines, South Asian, so Indian cuisines, where they use lots of lentils and chickpeas and other legumes of various sorts, as well as making interesting use of spices and herbs. They have a tendency to overcook vegetables in the Indian cuisine. They make up for some of the missing phytochemicals by the herbs and spices. And so certainly that sort of diet expands your non-meat, proteinaceous rich foods. Move to Southeast Asia and you've got more in the way of you've got a different kind of cuisine, whether you're talking about Vietnamese or Malaysian or Singaporean or Chinese. I mean, there's some rich ways in which, so Japanese extensive use of tofu. I appreciate that most people think tofu, that's wonderfly bland, rubbery, squishy stuff.
Just got to learn how to cook it, John.
Exactly so. One of the things, here's one trick with tofu that most of you may not have tried. Get your fairly firm tofu and stick it in the freezer, and stick it in the freezer overnight. And in the morning, let it thaw out, and the water will run out, and instead of having a squishy soft substance, you will end up with something that is much more sponge-like. It'll still be a little easy to tear, but it'll be sponge-like. Now marinate it. And suddenly you've got a really interesting, tasting meat-like substitute. And I'm not going to give you a cooking class, but seriously, think about this. Go to some interesting cookbooks from other cuisines and think about that, because that's the way to make some of those changes. You shift your cuisine. You don't say, "Oh, I'm not going to eat so and so," or "Oh, I'm going to add this in." find ways to build whole meals out of other people's cuisines.
Fantastic. How does physical activity lower our risk of cancers and other diseases? Is it purely through the health benefits of losing weight, or is it something else?
It's probably both. There's probably there is an anti-obesity effect. There is a physical activity that builds muscle and reduces body fat. But so there are probably some benefits that relate to that. That in turn reduces our risk of diabetes, reduces our risk of having high blood sugar. It also reduces our risk of having lots of inflammatory processes going on. Inflammatory processes are deeply rooted in the way in which the biological origins of cancer are strongly associated with inflammatory processes, which is one of the reasons why, for instance, it's been shown that taking a small amount of aspirin actually reduces your risk of colon cancer, and it's because it works as an anti-inflammatory. But we can make exercise our anti-inflammatory, although sometimes we need anti-inflammatories after the exercise. But getting out in the sunshine probably matters. You get a little more vitamin D, although you have to be a little careful about the melanomas, particularly in this part of the world. So there's a bunch of things here. There are probably some other things that, in the case of the colon, exercise just kind of speeds everything up a little bit, and that probably helps as well. So there's like all of these things, there isn't one pathway that's like one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball. It's a whole cascade of things that all make a difference, and they all make little bits of difference. That's the thing about the dietary story. It isn't like there's a magic food or a magic exercise pattern. It's just a whole package of stuff that generally brings our risk down.
Thank you. Being a Cancer Society event, we have a number of people attending tonight who are on their own cancer journey. What nutrition tips would you have for someone who is currently receiving cancer treatment or is moving towards being a cancer survivor?
Yep. Most of the recommendations I would make would be the same kind of recommendations. One of the things I'd be really careful about would be not eating your favourite foods at the same time that you're getting your chemotherapy, because the chemotherapy will make you feel sick, and then you'll associate feeling sick with all those things that you actually like and would like to be eating again. So just be a little bit careful about how you condition yourself with foods. You can actually put yourself off a whole bunch of foods that you might otherwise want because you begin to associate them with the nausea of the chemotherapy. I actually watched my spouse go through this. My spouse was diagnosed with breast cancer in her 40s, and she did a ton of very sensible things, and she was far more centered about all this than I was. I was much more distraught. She was just getting on with the job. But one of the things that happened was this association between certain foods and nausea. So just beware of that. But there are, people have tried to suggest that there are special foods that might help with recovery and so on. And there are whole medical systems that actually focus on giving people herbs and spices and so on. If you think about Chinese medicine and Indian medicine and so on, I do not claim any expertise in that. I do not know whether those work or not. I know lots of people who say they do. I know lots of people who say they work for them. But I do think it matters that you eat well, you exercise. One of the things my spouse did absolutely rigorously, and it was really hard work for her, go through chemotherapy and then go out and exercise and just, kind of walk her way through it, push her way through it. That matters too. It's that sort of sense of being in control of your life matters.
Thank you, John. Can you talk a little bit about what is known, just obviously you've got a huge background with colon cancer and research in colon cancer, but just something about what we can do to reduce our risk, just some top key points.
Physical activity, really central. Almost all the things we've talked about tonight really matter. Meat is one of the key players in colon cancer, both red meat and processed meat. So that matters. Smoking actually matters. I know that sounds weird, but there's a subset of colon cancers that's actually associated with tobacco. You tend not to think, how does that get down there? But it's actually, there's a subset of colon cancers that's actually quite closely related to smoking, so that matters. Alcohol is a really important risk factor for colon. This is why colon cancer is one of the most common cancers we see. It's because almost all of these, and sugar consumption is another one, almost all of these bad behaviours are associated with the risk of this particular cancer, which isn't true for all cancers. It's a mixture. But for colon, almost all of these are actually important. So the risk factors that we've been talking about tonight, if you can get some of those under control, some of them at a lower exposure rate, that makes a difference, particularly to colon cancer risk.
Thank you. We might take some questions from the audience now.
Everybody can hear my voice.
Okay, go ahead then.
My question is regarding smoothies. Now, every morning for the past 12 months or so, in the morning I've got up and made breakfast for my wife and I. And what I do is I get a food blender, I put in some milk, then I get a big handful of spinach leaves, 2 raw eggs, 2 cloves of garlic, a lump of ginger, banana, apple, a slug of olive oil, blend it all up, and we drink it. Right?
And then you go for a 5-mile walk.
We both find that lasts us until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah.
My question is to you, is that a good idea for blending on smooth food, or is it better to actually chunk your way through it?
Does it satisfy? Does it feel good? I mean, it's nutritionally pretty reasonable. I wouldn't have put the eggs in, but the rest of it's pretty good. I mean, that's the thing about diet. You're talking mostly about decent fresh food. You're blending it up. That means you're chewing it less, and chewing actually may be important. Because we have bugs in our mouths as well, and sometimes the bugs in our mouths are actually part of our system. But if it feels like a sensible thing for you to do, and it feels like a really good start to the day, and you have a it's perfectly sensible. How you build the day is up to you. I mean, for instance, I have an entirely different approach to the morning. I do not eat until about 11 o'clock on most days. I will sometimes if I'm in company and whatever. But I start my day with I have a long gap between my one meal and the next. But I don't think any of these are absolute rules. I think the way if you eat fresh food, if you eat it and it feels good, and you're sharing it in good company, yeah, it's okay. He's got a book.
Yeah, he's got a book. And Jose would like to know your thoughts whether there is a difference in cancer risk between vegetarians and vegans. I think it was linked to dairy.
There are no definitive data that will tell you that vegans are better off than vegetarians or vice versa. It may be if we had the perfect study, we'd be able to see differences. There are not even huge differences between people who eat modest amounts of meat, eat a good rich diet, well-prepared food, fresh, lots of whole grains, or all the sorts of things we've been talking about. There's not even really good evidence that they are worse off than the vegetarians or the vegans. What is clear is that there is a difference. The more into the processed foods you go, the higher sugar, the higher meat, etc. There are some reasons for thinking that milk provides people with some, certainly, if you think about it, breast milk's really useful for babies. And we have tended to then transfer that to cow milk, or sometimes to goats if we've got allergic responses. So that provides actually quite a lot of nutrition, and particularly for people who eat fermented milk products. There's a bunch of, then you're feeding the bugs in your gut. There's a bunch of that stuff that there's no clear evidence that it's contraindicated for any particular reason at all. There are some people have concerns about high protein diets and their impact on kidneys. Legitimate ones. If you've got kidney disease, then you really do need a low protein diet. But the dairy product stuff there's no clear evidence that it's a major issue, but it probably is if you've also got other sources of animal fat. If you're eating a lot of meat and drinking a lot of milk, then you're probably increasing your risk.
Cool. Does anyone else want to ask a question? I might just ask some of my helpers to take this mic down.
Thank you, Lydia.
Thank you. I'm Stuart, and thank you, Professor Potter, particularly for the tip on how to marinate my tofu more effectively. About 2.5 months ago, in the same venue, Professor Teresa Ann Davis from the Baylor College of Medicine gave a talk. And unfortunately I couldn't attend it, but the publicity material said that she would be making a case for the importance of animal-derived protein in a healthy diet. And this case seemed to be based on the fact that amino acids were in the correct proportions in animal protein, and therefore presumably not in the correct proportions in plant protein. And as a person who doesn't like to eat animal protein, this is of some interest and possibly concern to me. Could you comment on that, please?
Happy to. The idea that that proteins need to be balanced is a sort of interesting nutritional myth that goes all the way back to about 100 years ago now. It came out of the 1920s. It's not to say that there aren't reasons for having amino acids in some proportions, but the limiting amino acids in meat are exactly the same limiting amino acids that exist in the rest of foods that have proteins, namely sulfur-containing amino acids. So methionine and others. So you actually, it's actually a bogus argument. It's not to say it's not enthusiastically embraced, but it's the fact is that if you look at, If you look at the way in which some cultures have balanced their plant protein sources, for instance, in the middle, let's say Mexico, you've got corn and beans, maize and beans. In Indian cuisine, you've got wheat and lentils. In the Middle East, you tend to see wheat and chickpeas, wheat and other legumes. In some parts of Asia, you see the use of soybeans in conjunction with rice. And so, if you go to the cuisine story, you end up with balances in the way in which the amino acids are spread across the plants. If you think it's even important.
Thank you, Professor Porter. I'm Ivy. My question is about the children's diet.
Can you hold the mic just a little higher?
Oh, all right. My question about the children's diet. I've recently been pushed by my mother that I have to cook a meat dish. Apart from breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I have to cook one meat dish because she believes that the more meat my children has, better for them to grow. And after your talk, I'm thinking, if I cook those like kind of meat every day, I might increase the risk for my children have colon cancer in the in the future. Or if I reduce like 3 times a week, am I going to reduce the risk to have the colon cancer for them? They are 5 and 7 years old. Thank you.
Yeah, that's why I'm more interested in whole patterns over time. It seems to me that like our ancestors who may well have, got boozy under the tree of overripe fruit, or our ancestors who did indeed track that zebra down, or did, we would have pigged out. We have a tendency, and we're quite good at pigging out. So, but if it's occasional, it's not a big deal. If it's on a regular basis that we're eating lots of sugar or we're drinking lots of that, we have now normed so that people think 2 or 3 or 4 drinks a day, every day, is somehow normal. That is really toxic. We've got the same issue with eating lots of sugary foods. If you have a pig out on a couple of donuts, or even more than a couple if you want, but it's only occasionally, it's okay. It's how to spread those exposures out so they just become occasional things, and reduce and spread it out so that you've got more a higher plant food diet on a regular basis. That's the direction to go in. But it's not to torture yourself to make it really hard to get there. And it's certainly not to beat your family up who want to, everyone has to come along quietly and gently. And it's a really, this is tough stuff, because food can be such a fight in a family. And it's really important not to make it a fight. You just work on what do we know, what have we learned, and then use it to improve our capacity to prepare and buy food. But it's a gentle process, not a right. If you're on your own, you can make those sorts of rapid decisions. But if you've got a whole family to look after, you need to think about how to get from here to there.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Stephen, and my wife is going through treatment. She's finished her treatment, but she used to love fruits. But since her treatment, she hardly eats any fruits. just gone over it. Is the sugar content in fruits a problem?
Again, it depends on how much. The predominant sugar in a whole bunch of fruits is fructose. And we metabolize fructose not quite as well as we metabolize glucose. Sucrose is just empty calories, and we have a lot of sucrose in our food. The Americans have increasingly got a huge amount of fructose in their food, which they extract out of corn. And it creeps into products that are imported. So if you see high fructose corn syrup on any food you're eating, don't eat it. This is really nasty stuff. But fructose in food, in the orange, in the apple, in the whatever it is, remember it's mixed in with all those other things. When you juice food, you reduce the amount of fiber. So then you've kicked up the sugar dose quite a lot. Because if you think about how many oranges you need to squeeze to give yourself a glass of orange juice, again, an occasional glass of orange juice, fine. But if you're drinking orange juice all the time, think about how many oranges you would be eating and ask yourself, would I really be able to eat that many oranges? And if you can't eat that many oranges, you probably shouldn't be drinking that glass on a regular basis. But fructose in food, in naturally occurring in food, should be fine.
Thank you. Sorry, I just have one more question. First and foremost, I'd like to apologize to whole grain organics, is it? That I'm going to ask this question. Is there a big difference between organic vegetables and non-organic vegetables? I mean, it's quite expensive to buy organic stuff, and moreover, it's hard to come by. So,
yep. Can
you please answer that question?
It's a good question because it plagues people and it beats them up. Here's what I think about this, and it's actually hard to tell. There are a bunch of papers in the literature, some of which say, look, there's a real difference between organic vegetables and non-organic, and there's a whole bunch of other papers that say the opposite. And it's really hard to work out who's got that right. Here's my thought about this. There are in conventionally grown vegetables, fruit, everything else. There are some chemicals in there that are, as it were, not part of our. If we think about, again, our ancestors wandering around, they never saw this stuff. Some of it we can metabolize, but some of it is cumulative toxins. Some of them are fat soluble, and they end up in our system, and they kind of sit there. So if you think that matters, and I'm not telling you there is rock solid evidence that it matters, but there is some evidence that some of these compounds are toxic. If you think it matters, then going to buy organic vegetables and fruit and paying the premium that it usually entails is an okay thing to do. It may be a fine thing to do, but it's certainly an okay thing to do. But if you cannot find those, then buying conventional it's better to eat good fruit, fresh fruit and vegetables than not eat them. But you might decide that it's better to have the organic ones than the conventionally grown ones. I am of the opinion that if I can buy my food grown in organic fashion, and I've got a number of growers in Nelson that I patronise. On the other hand, if at the very times of year I can't get it, then I'll just get the conventionally grown stuff. Again, don't make it don't make it a whip for yourself. Just make a choice, but don't agonize about it, and better the vegetables and fruit than no vegetables and fruit.
On fermented foods at all?
Yeah, good question. So fermented foods generally have always been, again, they've been part of, certainly of our food since we've been involved in agriculture. You can imagine that fermented foods all came about by accident, right? I mean, that's how we learned to make bread, because we were making, we were grinding up flour and we added water, and then it sat around for a while, and then we found, oh, look what happens, it rises, and we prepare that. The same thing would have certainly happened in the way we learned to make cheese and yogurt and all those things. They would have been an accidental, brilliant observation that almost certainly a woman made a long time ago. And they would have been, a lot of them would have become part, particularly once we were in agricultural communities and we had access to things like milk. We would have been making those foods. One of the things that they do is they act as a source of some of the bugs that are beneficial to our gut. They are often more easily digested. If you have a lactose intolerance, then eating yogurt is fine because all the lactose has gone to lactic acid. So there's a bunch of reasons for eating this. Can I tell you that they are magic foods and they do, they prevent this, that, and no. They might, but I don't know any evidence that says they do. One of the things that I think is really important to remember, I actually say this in the book that some of you may enjoy. There are no magic foods. There are just good eating patterns, and there are better eating patterns and worse eating patterns. But if you enjoy your yogurt or you enjoy your kombucha or you enjoy, fine, great.
It was such an amazing and interesting talk. What the question I wanted to ask, when the comments you've been making about childhood obesity, and then talking about that it's if the sort of what we would regard as, I suppose we've come to regard as treat food, that things that have got high sugar content. I am really concerned about, and I can see, particularly in a school setting where, there's a big push now to have water only. But what we still tend to see is the sausage sizzles that are the fundraisers. It's the school galas that are going on that are often, lots and lots of baking that's being sold. And I just wonder, us as a community, how on earth do we support schools to make the choices that we're not perpetuating that same behaviour over and over again?
Again, the principle that you're espousing is right. It would be really good to reduce the exposure and the promotion of foods that we might not regard as being beneficial or we might regard as harmful. You have to get there, as with the family, bringing the family along. If you're going to bring the community along, we've got to do it gently. We've got to get it at some decent agreement that when we're going to do a fundraiser, we're going to do it with, special vegan food or special Indian food, or but get everybody to agree that that's an okay thing to do, because people are much more comfortable with a sausage sizzle, and that's what they expect, and they're much more comfortable with bags of donuts than they are with thinking about fresh fruit. If we're going to get from there to here, it's gentle, it's education, it's bringing people along. It's not sort of wagging your finger at them, and it's not. We are faced, however, with massive amount of advertising that goes into selling the sugary foods, selling the sugary drinks. We have to do some other things as well, and I've been trying to convince people that, and I'm not the only one, that a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages would be a really smart thing to do. We know it actually works. It actually reduces consumption. And you know, we're putting water only into some of our public places. Hospitals and DHBs have done it quite a lot, largely pushed by Rob Beaglehole, who's been a really strong advocate for that particular shift. He even managed to get WHO in Geneva to do it. He went over there and did a sabbatical, and got them to throw out all of their sugar-sweetened beverages as well. So we can do it in institutional steps. We can do it in institutional places. We can try and do some things with law. And regulation and so on. But in the end, we have to all agree that this is an okay thing to be doing. And that takes time. But no reason not for if the Cancer Society is going to put something on, then, you know, let's do it with the things that you're in control of that then, and you can make it. You know, we're putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak. But it's time. It's agreement. We've taken a while to get here, and in the face of massive advertising, to norm these things. Who gave permission? Did anyone in this room give permission for all of those bottles of alcohol to be our exit from the airline and then our entrance back into the... No, none of us said this is a good idea. But the power of large, rich corporations to change those sorts of settings, we've got weaker tools, but we should use them to the best of our ability, but do it in a gentle way.
These things aren't getting good. If nobody buys that alcohol, those outlets will disappear.
But people buy it all the time. They think they've got a bargain. Watch them. I thought you were bringing me a durian for a while there.
Bright yellow, of course.